Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Um, we have a couple of topics today. The first is what are called Easter eggs. And I seem to be seeing this more and more these days, and I had no idea what they were until I guess Taylor Swift has made them popular with a lot of Easter eggs in her songs. Is that accurate?
No, H.P. Lovecraft actually made it popular first, but
Okay, 100 years ago, but in the modern
Well,
era.
no, in the comics world and in those movies and stuff, really, there's a ton of them.
Okay, well,
That's
those are two worlds I've never been a part of. So I first heard about this when it became a thing with Taylor Swift. Not that I listened to Taylor Swift, but you couldn't escape Taylor Swift the last couple of years, and I started seeing these reference to Easter eggs. And then one of our, I think, favorite writers out there that most of us, if not all of us, have got to know, Carrie Rubin. She published a book recently, and I read it. And after I read it, she said, "Did you see the Easter egg I left there for you?" What are you talking about? So I went back and yes, there's a reference to a character who has a medical condition similar to well, exactly the same as mine, and that was her Easter egg for me. Um, and then I know that and Bertold in his most recent book has the main character frequently drinking a Paxton beer. So I'm assuming that that's a
yes,
Easter egg as
I,
well.
I read that.
And I guess the thing to me is when I read, I don't know what it is about. I just don't make those connections. I mean, obviously Paxton beer, that's a very direct and obvious reference to me, but like the character who had a medical condition similar to one of mine, it's like, okay, but millions of people have that. So I don't necessarily make that connection to me or if it's somebody else like that. So anyway, um, because of Carrie doing that and Bertold's reference to Paxton beer, I've decided in the piece that I'm working on, I'm going to have a bunch of Easter eggs. And there's one for Bertold, there's one for Audrey, there's one for Brennan, there's one for Carrie Rubin, although it's actually for one of her pen names, Morgan Mayer, because it's a reference to something that occurs in the book that Morgan Mayer published. I'm still trying to come up with one for you, Richard. I have an idea, but I'm not completely sold on it. But anyway, so I guess the question is, uh, what do you think of Easter eggs? Do you do them? Does it just a topic for conversation?
Bartold, you want? I know
oh,
you want.
okay, I
Okay.
have a lot of
Use
it.
a
So
lot.
I'll as I jumped in with, yes, H.P. Lovecraft would do this. He was famous for linking his stories to other authors that he knew in his circle. Probably the most famous one is The Haunter of the Dark, which is about a character who is obviously modeled on Robert Bloch, who was the author of Psycho, who was a friend of Lovecraft's. There's all sorts of references to him, including, like, this is going too far nowadays. Lovecraft included his actual address in Wisconsin in the story. You wouldn't want to dox people nowadays.
No.
But I always thought that was cool. And so I try in my stories to include uh, little things like that, especially for everyone who I know is going to read, or I at least suspect is going to read my stories. So, hence the Paxton's beer. I think I did make some kind of reference to Carrie Rubin in that one as well. Um, I try wherever possible to get in a little thing. I try to keep it subtle. Because basically I want it to be like a joke where I know it and the person it's for knows it, and otherwise, if you don't know anything about it, it doesn't make any difference to the story. It just, it goes right by you because it can get. I've seen cases where it can be too much and people get self-indulgent, and if I feel like I'm reading an in joke between two different people and I'm like a third party, it just sort of feels awkward at that point because it's like, well, this isn't really for me. So I try to keep it to just a subtle little thing. Um, the other thing I'll say is that it doesn't just have to be. I've seen Easter eggs also consist of like uh just other references to things in the real world. Like I've never actually read the Game of Thrones books, but apparently in one of them there's some offhand mention of something that is basically a reference to the fact that George R. R. Martin is a fan of the New York Giants, and they
Hmm.
they won two Super Bowls around the time he was writing. So there's some sort of subtle reference in there to this. Um, that's and I don't know. I don't actually know how I feel about that. That would be sort of weird, even you know. There's a thing called immersion breaking where it's like I'm reading my fantasy novel and then I find a reference to the real world in it. I don't know. You sort of
Mhm.
forget you're reading the novel and it takes you out of the experience. So that's a risk, I guess I would say, with Easter eggs.
I think Easter eggs are really originally were supposed to be sort of a nice surprise, not something that you would be consciously looking for, and suddenly you notice it and you think, "Wow, look at that!" And the other thing about them is, I think because only some people will pick up on it, it sort of gives you this feeling of being an insider. But I think maybe that only comes out a lot if you share your Easter egg experience with people you know, and if some of them say, "Yeah, I noticed that too," then it's kind of like working. But yeah, I think they should definitely be a very small part of a work, not something that you spend a lot of time on. So yeah, I actually did some H.P. Lovecraft Easter eggy things in at least one of my Herbert West books. I know that the three characters go for a picnic somewhere near Kingsport, and they mention the strange high house in the mist legend that Lovecraft created, that kind of thing. And there is one in my latest book, Winter Journeys, where the university that the main character goes to is the university I went to, University of British Columbia. And so people who know that institution will recognize maybe some places or references to it. And there's one I put in very consciously, which was where she says that she and her romanticism class fellow students go to some bar which they figure is better than the main campus pub, which was called the Pendulum. Now, the main campus pub at UBC was called the Pit. So I
That's
put that in, and only somebody who would know that Pit pub would pick that up, and also the reference to the Poe story. But that's it, and that's about the only one I would really call an Easter egg that I can think of in that book.
I I have when I had to think about this when we first mentioned it, and then I'm thinking about it again. I think a lot of Easter eggs I put in The Devil and the Wolf were obviously I wouldn't call Easter eggs, I would call them inside jokes because the people I would play online with, when we talked about these characters forever and they were in there online, I put a lot, I mean a ton of that. It was for them. It was for them. So they could pick up the book and recognize like why JR is obsessed with number five or whatever. But still, they're there and they were crafted for that purpose. Um, but then there are a couple of things that I don't know. I can only call free association as I write. Like when I was writing a line, Hermes was speaking and Perseus kills his grandfather. And I know I had just finished watching a Marx Brothers movie because I love the Marx Brothers. And there was the Groucho line, anything farther, further, or anything further, farther, that can't be right. But I had him say anything far further. And he goes, far further, that can't be right. But, I don't know if that's an Easter egg, but there was one. There was one that I know can be an actual Easter egg, and that was in The Devil and the Wolf. I had an antique shop and I called it Conliff's. And I think I mentioned this to you, Berthold, once ages ago. But Conliff's Antique Shop was the shop across the way from the original movie, The Werewolf. where Talbot is looking through the window and he sees this woman that ends up becoming his girlfriend, and she's the daughter of Conliff, who owns an antique shop. And I just thought, well, Wolfman, etc. I intentionally put that in, but all the other things were sort of stream of conscious. There are lines from songs, and in fact, there was a chapter heading tea and light refreshments. I had just finished watching Hyacinth Bouquet on Keeping Up Appearances. So, so there's a lot of those, but they're unintentional Easter eggs. I don't know. They're sort of stream of conscious Easter eggs. You would never connect them to anything per se. But if you knew I liked Keeping Up Appearances and you saw tea and light refreshments, that might click. So yeah, I might do a better job of them in the future. I don't know. Probably
I
not.
think maybe the accidental kind might be more subtle.
It's
So,
definitely
yeah,
very
I think
subtle.
if they happen, that's sort of an Easter egg for the author, too. It can
I
say,
I
wow,
don't
look at
expect,
that.
yeah, I don't expect anything. In fact, the Easter egg for the author is if somebody does say, "Hey, I recognize that from," I'll be shocked because I really don't expect anyone to get them. They're just, things that are happening around me, and they end up in the book, recognizable to some level, but you know, not really. Oh, that was in one. Oh, there was another one I brought up on one of our other video casts, whatever. I was listening to AWOL Nation, and the line at that time was, "You're all still here," and that's exactly what Mephistopheles said at that moment. So like he turns around and says, you're all still here." So again, no one would ever get that because there's no context connection. So anyway,
One of the kind of accidental ones that I have in this story now is there's a scene where one of the main characters pulls out a gun and is wants to shoot someone, and he says, "You killed my wife. Prepare to die." So, and I left it at that because that's just you know what that's from. But now I'm thinking I really should say he should say that, and then the character who he's pointing the gun at should say, "That's inconceivable," and have him like take another step closer and say, "I don't think you know what that word means." Have you seen The Princess Bride, Audrey?
Nope, I haven't.
Okay,
oh my
this is
gosh,
from
yeah,
from The
I haven't.
Princess Bride.
I
that's
haven't seen a lot
cultural.
of things.
That's become cultural. Yeah, a lot of.
Yeah. But
Mhm.
I mean, one of the things someone may read this and think I've overdone it, but as Bertold knows, reading probably the first half of this story at some point, it's a really bizarre world. And so some of these Easter eggs that I'm leaving in the story allow me to expand on the bizarreness. I'll just leave it at that.
Mhm.
So one of the things I'm doing in this is my high school teacher friend up in Oregon, he likes to send me strange names. He reads a lot of history books about, in the 1800s, and he just reads all sorts of stuff. And whenever he comes across a strange name, he sends it to me. So part of the bizarreness is that a lot of the people who the president has surrounded himself have very strange names, like Fremont Thrower and Toussaint Lagrange, and there's a few others. So I just have all these weird names in this book as a reference to him. So,
That's
but that came up before I ever knew what an Easter egg was.
right. See, those are the personal ones. Like I said, I have a
Yeah.
lot. Yeah.
So anyway,
There were also in Perseus a couple, I don't know if I could call them Easter eggs, but if you loved mythology and you read the myth, you would see comments made by people were referring to other myths. And that was intentional. That I wanted, because I loved the Greek myths, and I want anyone who read the Greek myths and loved them to go through this and go, "Oh yeah, I know that story, and I know that story." So yeah, there was that too. There's I guess I don't know again if those are exactly Easter eggs, but they're outside references to other tales that are in context. So
The thing I do like about the personal ones is that I think it's kind of a nice way if you know somebody's going to read the book of just sort of thanking people, um, which is, I think, more fun than the acknowledgement section.
I did see myself show up in one of your Halloween stories, so it was nice.
I will tell you, Bertold, there is no space elevator in this story.
Oh, that's too bad. Well, next time.
Yes, but you've identified as we talked about on Twitter this morning, you've identified the cool technological advancement that will be made in your sequel, right?
Yes.
It's a gigantic city suspended from an asteroid that orbits around the Earth and never actually touches Earth. The gigantic city. It floats in the air.
Yeah. I'm sort of feel bad I didn't think of this sooner.
Yeah.
You need to put it right in the Lagrange point, right? That's how they do it.
Anything else on Easter eggs, or should we move to the next topic?
We'll move to the next topic. So the next topic is prompted by a tweet, and I'll just read the tweet. The first few books someone writes really show their core voice and values. Everything that comes after is improved skill, more experience, better marketing, but those first few books are extra special. They're what all the future stories are built on. So what do you think about that?
Well, the first few, it depends. Are they the first few books someone writes, or are they the first few books someone publishes? Because especially in traditional publishing, the first book by somebody then, it's always touted as their debut, maybe their fifth or sixth book. And they might have been writing and sending stuff out and getting rejections, and finally this book gets accepted and published, and it's called their debut book, but it really is not their first book. So that's where that statement might fall down right there. But yeah.
Well, but does it? Does it? Because maybe from the point of view of the author, the first book that never got published was really more from the spirit and what you're, and from their point of view, what you're seeing is because they've gotten better at their craft, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So it may fall, it may not. I thought, honestly, I thought there was a lot of truth to it, but not, and I don't believe in generalizations, but I knew for me, and a couple of people I know, that's very true, because I think the first time you decide to write a book, you've had stuff burbling up. Maybe it's cathartic, maybe it's not. I don't know, but you have a lot of stuff that has been building up, and you finally get that impetus. I'm going to write the book, and it's always going to be a first voice, your first open voice, right? So it's got to contain a sheer amount of that. And then after that, I just side thing, because I tend to do that. I tend to go off on tangents. But we've heard people say, lots of people who are who are writers say, I'm finding it harder and harder to either come up with ideas or to get something going, et cetera. And that is because I think you got the big stuff out. Doesn't mean that there won't be more big stuff. And in my case, it wasn't the characters or anything that I'm alluding to. It was the plot and how I was framing my first book. I know I've mentioned before, but plot-wise, the underlying theme about good and evil, what's good, what's evil, and this is mildly mentioned in the book, but it keeps being posed: what is good, what is evil, and that came out of how upset I was that 16 years earlier with the Trade Center attack. Mm-hmm. And I've mentioned this, that there were the people who flew those planes were more than convinced, obviously, for doing that, they were going straight to heaven. They saw themselves as saints, heroes, good people. And the rest of us saw it as horrific, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I don't have to go back to that. And it still happens people see themselves as good and pure and holy and honest. And And that's when it shakes your core foundation, and you have to say to yourself, well, what is really good? What have I decided good? Because we always assume, especially when you read other books or watch, TV shows, etc., that everyone agrees on what's good and what's bad, right? You feel that, and you say, well, yeah, it's everyone's gonna know. You can't do that. That's totally wrong, etc. Well, but anyway, so that's at the heart, and I don't think I'll probably uh, ever do that again naturally. I may have to think to myself, what is a topic I want to be a subtle theme in here? That was just visceral. It had to come out. So yeah, I think there was some truth in that. And then, of course, there is also truth in the other half of the statement that after you've done a book or two or three, etc., you are honing your craft. I mean, there's no getting out of that. Uh, so I do know authors who have specifically said when I said, I love that book that you wrote, and it's one of their first books, they go, oh, I don't even want to look at it anymore, they say. I think they see it as weak and whatever. I'm like, no, no, it's good. Because their skills are increased. So yeah, I thought at least I'm going to assume many authors that there's a kernel of truth in that statement.
Yeah, I think there is. Actually, it makes me think that anyone who has had a bunch of books that they wrote before they got published maybe should go back and look at those first few after they've developed their writing skills a bit and maybe rework them. Whereas often people say, "Oh yeah, those first my first book was crap. I'll never look at it again. It's an
Yeah, go
embarrassment,"
back.
and maybe not.
How would you redo it if you had the skills that you think you have now? So I think that would be great. At least for personal thing. Now me on the other hand, with my ego, I love my books. I mean, it's been 5 years between each, and I go back and look at them, and I'm still like them. I'm not. There's no shame in anything. I mean, I find mistakes and stuff and things I would have written a little better, but you know, I don't know if that's good or not. Maybe show that I have no potential for growth.
A few weeks ago, I went back and read the two novellas that I've published. And like you, Richard, I like them. I mean, and they're two completely different kinds of stories and whatever. But whenever I go back and read something I published or wrote before, it's like, wow, I did that. So,
Yeah, yeah, well, that's the same with me. I have to really take a close dive into my first book when I did that audiobook thing with Google Play Books, where I went through, listened to the whole thing, but with the artificial voice and followed the text and made some adjustments. And I thought, yeah, I mean, apart from using the word that more than I would do now, and a few other things, I thought it was pretty good. So yeah, that's reassuring. But that actually was the first novel I wrote, Friendship
yeah.
of Mortals, and the first that got published because it was published by me.
When I first saw this tweet, my initial reaction was, well, this is just nonsense. As I typically respond. Think in some of these, part of it is it's the generalization, which I'll just let go for now. But as you were talking, Richard, one of the things that struck me is that this comment implies that our stories are based on our values, which gets to this place where I mean, I go back to my hatred for high school English class, which was, what's the author's point? Why did the poet say this? Why was the door red? There's always, and I don't write stories to assert my values. I don't understand why stories have to portray the writer's values. And in fact, from my perspective, the stories that I'm most proud of are the stories I've written where I can read the story and say there is absolutely nothing of me in this story other than the fact that I wrote it. The characters are not me, they're not based on me. What they're going through is not something I've ever gone through. It's just the story I wanted to tell.
But isn't
But I
there,
did.
yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
just curious, like, what was the driver that made you want to tell the story?
I've described this as I come up with an idea and I want to see if I can turn the idea into a story.
Okay.
I mean, there's a couple things I've written where there was a point, there was a message, there was a value being expressed. The best example of that is the novel I wrote, published and then unpublished, that will never be published again, because it was definitely semi-autobiographical, and it had to do with a lot of experiences I was going through at the time. But other than that, I can't think of much else that I've written where I was trying to express a value or a message or do anything more than see if I could tell a story based on the idea that I came up with. I will say that the second part of the tweet about, you know, improved skill, more experience, that's definitely true. I mean, that's if you keep doing something, you should get better at it, and that can change how you write stories or tell stories and what you're actually trying to do with them. But anyway, that was my thought on that tweet.
Do you know, not before you answer, Bertold, you know what occurred to me just now? It I, this may be this topic may be true across the arts because I'm thinking of bands that released their first album versus their second and third, and then maybe 10th and 12th. And, some are up and down. Others are like, it was, and others, there's an increase and then maybe they don't have the popularity, but the music itself is constantly improved. I don't know. Anyway, sorry for it all, but that popped in my head.
No, I think you make a good point there. And I think there are just different trajectories. It's certainly, I think it sometimes happens that somebody will they'll work on a book for a long time. They pour their heart and their soul into this
I
book.
feel seen.
They make it really good. They release it. It's awesome. And then they're like, I should put out another book. And then the second book is just sort of they didn't have that same amount of creative energy to pour into it. They just sort of put something together and then put it out. And so you can see sort of it feels like there's a drop off. It's um, on the other hand, I think sometimes, yeah, people start out slow, as Richard was describing, and you can see them getting better and better until they work up to something. To some degree, it goes right back to what Audrey said that our perspective on this is skewed very much by what got published first.
Yeah.
If if somebody has their magnum opus that they worked on a long time and it never got published for many years, and then finally it did, you go, oh, it feels like they were building up to that. But maybe it was out of order. So in some ways, I guess what I'm saying is it almost feels like this is just random when when something will really strike. But as I'm thinking more about my own books, I do feel like the directorate was the one I spent the most time on. It has sort of the biggest concepts. And everything I've written after that sort of feels, I mean, I've enjoyed all those stories, but they're not, in some sense, they don't have the same depth to them. And I would like to be able to write something like the directorate again. And hopefully I will someday. But so in a way that can happen, that you feel like you do your best work and then after that it's just not quite the same. But I don't know. It's such a I think it's almost a thing that you have to say varies from person to person, different
Yeah.
different experiences.
It's funny because One Night in Bridgeport was the first novel I wrote and I published it. And if I go back and read it, and I did this a few years ago, I went back and read it because one of the things I struggle with these days is I can't write a novel anymore. They're always novellas. And part of the reason, in going back to look at One Night in Bridgeport, is that book is filled with context and history and not excessive description, but there's so much that I put in that novel that I just don't think of these days when I write. So, you know, all of the bells and whistles in there are not in what I write now. I describe as I just want to write the story. I don't want to write what kind of pants the character was wearing. That was something from Twitter yesterday. I don't know what kind of pants the character is wearing. It's irrelevant to the story. Why do I have to tell you that? You know? So I just want to tell the story. That's it. That's what my to the extent I have any improved skill or more experience, has that has led me to stripping down a lot of the stuff that, like I said, in the first book or two I wrote, I had, and now I like don't even know how to do that anymore. So
I was thinking about the values thing again, and I think it's a mistake to write a book where your whole point of doing it is to express your values. In fact, I think that should be more like Easter eggs, where it shows up in the story, but it isn't up front. And as people read it, and when they get to the end, they'll kind of have an idea maybe of something to do with the author's values, but otherwise it becomes like a didactic thing,
Yeah.
where you're actually saying this is what you should think.
it's not really a novel anymore. It's not.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I wasn't taking that part, the values, as literally. I wasn't thinking of some polemic or anything like that where somebody is preaching in their book. Although, I've read books like that. C.S. Lewis. I oh boy. But I'm not saying that. What I was saying is just the values you are comfortable with. That's part of your makeup. That's got to get reflected on some level. I mean, that's just psychology. And again, that's a strong bit of my background. And that was my point about the good and evil. Your values that you have are going to be reflected in your book. I almost can't say specifically that unless you consciously go against that, it's unavoidable. So, yeah.
And this, Mark, I don't want to give you flashbacks to high school, but I think this is what the game of let's figure out what the author's values are from reading this. It can
Yeah.
come from there, right? Because
If someone ever tries to do that with one of my stories, I'm going to hunt them down and shoot them.
I know he's out of fashion for very many reasons, but one of my favorite
I
parts
think
of
I
the
know what
book-
my next review will be. Sorry.
That's right.
Well, I already killed you once.
Go ahead, Richard, I'm sorry.
That's right. One of my favorite parts of a Woody Allen movie was he's online to see a movie and he's having an argument with somebody about what I don't remember who the author was or whatever, but what they meant in their book. And then behind him taps on the shoulder, is that author? He says, no, I wrote the book and this is what I meant.
And Woody probably disagreed with him.
Right. Because that's the point is like, yeah, I too, Mark, you don't want to say what was going on inside the author's mind. No one does that, and I don't like when I see that or hear that either. No one's ever done that with my books because not enough people have read them, but
I wasn't going to bring this up, but I have to now. Just yesterday on Twitter, I saw somebody said, oh gosh, I wish I could. I don't have Twitter open, but the wording, it was something along the lines of people don't misunderstand Paul Atreides. Frank Herbert misunderstood the character that he wrote.
Yes.
What the person
right.
And it had to do with whether or not he was a villain.
Yeah.
It was whether or not he was really a hero or a villain.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And that actually, again, in the comics world happens a lot where people will bluntly tell the author that they didn't know what they were talking about with their character, or that, or the author will say, well, I was, the character's doing this for this reason. And they'll say, no, he wasn't. it's astounding how often that will happen. That they'll actually, say my interpretation is correct and the author's interpretation is wrong. I'm like,
Well,
no,
see, that's just it, though. I mean, when a book gets out there and gets read by people, which is what we all want, right? It sort of becomes their book.
yes,
And
yes.
they can do things with it that maybe the author doesn't even know. Well, we wouldn't know about it if someone's talking about our book somewhere. We're not there. We don't know about it. But that's kind of the chemistry of the whole literary thing, is like you put the stuff out there and people read it and interpret it, and it inspires other things, and there's movies and all that stuff, and it becomes sort of part of the culture. Not most of us, of course, but books that are widely known. And I think that's kind of what we're all hoping will happen with our books, way more than selling 1 million copies and making money.
Yes, definitely. I've said that a million times. But I mean, one thing we didn't have, because it wasn't when I was younger, in another age, because it wasn't possible as it is now, but fanfic, right? And I wonder, like, if someone ever did write fanfic with my characters, how would I feel? I mean, yeah, flattered. That's the first thing. But then I would be like, I don't think
What
he
did
would
you
say
do with
that.
them?
I don't think he would say that, or he would do that. That's not really
It's kind of like, when they turn a story into a movie and the director does what they want with
Right.
the
Oh
characters and the
gosh.
storyline, and the author's like, well, it's great, you screwed it up.
That must be horrifying on that level. The fanfic,
Yeah.
at least it's a fan, but
Yeah.
oh gosh, I always felt bad for Agatha Christie. I still do, and she's not around. Um, but yeah, I would bite my tongue though if fanfic was written for any of my stuff, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
but I would just. That's how you see the characters. Good. That's go with it.
You liked it
Well,
enough to
my
write a
first
story.
book is a
Right.
fanfic on the
Yeah.
H.P. Lovecraft
Yeah.
story, in a way. I mean, a fanfic that got much bigger than the original. And I know that H.P.L. didn't really care for his Herbert West stories. Like, he thought they were kind of a pain having to crank them out and redo the recap because it was a serial, right? And so I doubt if he'd be too worried. Besides, he wasn't really a character guy. He was more of a setting guy, and that's a whole different area.
Atmosphere,
Yeah, atmosphere.
everything.
So, Bertold, I'm really, really close to being done with the jump. I could probably finish it in this weekend. And when I publish it, I look forward to your review where you try to identify what my values and what my message was.
I'm gonna identify values. I'm gonna identify what you symbolized with every single thing in it.
Please.
And then I am going to respond to that with a comment that says, no, what Mark was trying to say here,
Yes.
Mark was trying to do.
This could go on for years.
Yeah.
And just remember, the door was red because that's what color paint I had. I still remember that from, I think it was 12th grade English. Why was the door red? Why does it matter?
What can you remember what the story was?
No, I think
Oh,
I think it
darn.
was a poem. I don't remember, but I just remember that Helen Crum, our teacher, standing up there and saying, "Why did the author make the door red?"
No, she was probably desperate for some sort of topic to get kids
I don't know.
talking about the
I was gonna
thing.
say there's a couple of things there. One is when you're teaching, you just want people to discuss.
Yeah,
So, hopefully they read it. That's the first thing. And if they didn't, maybe they'll pick something up about it. And the second thing is, I think with poetry, sometimes I think those, because
there is.
yeah, there might be. But
I don't disagree.
I still know, I'm agreeing with you. Don't
Uh,
forget that. I know, because I remember the class. I remember the classes with those same questions. And what was the author trying to say? What was the author trying to say? That's kind of insulting in itself. But
the author said it. He didn't try. He
yeah,
said it.
not
Or
trying.
she.
What are you trying to impute on what the author was saying?
Yeah.
but yeah, I agree with you, but I do understand also from the flip side of teaching, you just want people to
I
learn
know.
and
Yeah.
participating. So a little of both.
I'm gonna go ahead and add one thing to this, sort of, which is that sometimes there are certain works an author may write that are like they can't say what they mean explicitly, usually because of like censorship or something. So they have
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
allegorical
Yeah.
nature to it. In cases like that, I can see why you would be like, well, what was the author really suggesting here without outright saying it?
Right.
That's like the one case where I could see that coming up.
Right. Fantasy and sci-fi are noted for that, to be
Yeah.
honest. What is the current social condition I want to reflect in my story? Again, does also reflects their values. So there is that to be said, and sometimes it is obvious. And even the author will say, I'm proud of my work because it puts a light on blank, whatever it is they're trying to get across. Um, but you let the author say that.
Yeah.
You on your part say, well, I took it to mean, or the way I see it, just yeah. Don't tell us what the author. Tell us what you thought. We just had, yeah, we had Bertold and I recently had a long side conversation. I'm not going to go into, but it was about Dune. And again, I was like, well, this is how I see it. Saw this, and it's painted large, and Bertold said, oh, I see it like this, and it was interesting because you're getting, again, how you interpret the painting, basically that. It's not the same as saying what Frank meant.
This is what I think is so cool about reading is that we all can read the same book, but we get slightly different things out of it, like the way
Yeah.
you picture a character. Especially, this is what's great about not describing them in detail. The way I picture a character is not the same way you picture a character, perhaps. And I think
Well, that's it. I'm going to describe the characters in the jump, every single one of them in intimate detail now.
down to the tips of his
What?
shoelaces were red.
Yes,
And
exactly.
here's why.
Exactly.
And my next afterword will start with, here's what I meant.
Yeah. Mine will say there are no values expressed. Actually, that should be a disclaimer
Right.
at the beginning
A
of the story.
disclaimer.
There is no point, there is no message, there are no values here. It's
I have
just
no
a story.
values.
This is a value-free book.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, that's funny.
Anyway. Okay. Are we good?
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay. Now I got to go finish up the jump because I just said I could.
Yeah. Yes, well, I'll be looking out for it.
I'm going to go start chapter 2. Probably not today. Tomorrow. I got too many things on the shelf.
Yes. First, I have to go weed the front yard.
Right. I got to set up tomato cages, etc. But
I
There you
have
go.
to cut all the dead flowers off my lilac because they look bad now.
Bertold needs to plant his pumpkin
Yeah.
patch.
Yes.
actually, you should have already. You should have done that
Yeah.
a couple weeks ago.
True.
Okay. Thank you for the conversation.
Yes,
Yes,
indeed.
thank
Yeah.
you.
Have a good rest of your
Bye.
weekend. Bye.
You too.
Bye.